Hi there, it's Adam Schmela back again with another training video. Today we're going to talk about the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of how workflows are created, a little bit of the methodology behind our process and how we think about workflow creation, as well as the basic components of workflows. So the first thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is that if you're not familiar with workflows, it's important to understand the three basic components that make up a workflow in Redtail CRM. Those are the step, and you have to have at least one step in a workflow. You also have to have at least one task within a workflow. And then you need to have outcomes, at least one outcome in order to have a functioning workflow. So the step is, if you think about the best analogy that I can use to explain the different components of the workflow is like a recipe. And so the steps of a workflow are the recipe. The tasks within the workflow would be like the shopping list if you're at the grocery store. So what I mean by that is that if we want to bake a chocolate cake, we know that we have to do step 1, then step 2, then step 3, then step 4, then step 5. We have to follow the order of the recipe in order to get the outcome that we want. However, when we're at the grocery store, it doesn't matter if we put the ingredients for step 1, if we put this one in the cart first and then this one in the cart, or if we put this one in the cart first and then this one. The task completion for each step in a workflow does not need to be done in order. But the steps, in order for a workflow step to be accomplished, and the tasks within that step to be accomplished, the workflow must already be on that process. So you cannot work ahead. If the workflow is on this step when it's attached to a client, we are not able to do the tasks necessary on subsequent steps until the workflow is advanced. So how do we advance it? That's where outcomes come into play. An outcome in a workflow is one of the most important components of the workflow, and it is typically what gets firms hung up on actually building and creating workflows for themselves. Because outcomes, are the if-then relationship to what has already transpired and what you want to have happen next. So an important point that I would ask you to write down and emphasize, and you'll hear me say this over all these training videos, while I'm certainly going to be going through a lot of information, there are a few times when I'll ask you to write something down, and that's a really, really good nugget of information or a best practice that I'd really want to make sure doesn't get lost in all of the noise and information that I'm sharing. So here's one to keep in mind. Specifically when it pertains to outcomes in workflows, what I want you to focus on when you look at an outcome, and again, outcomes are the if this happened, then we want this to happen. When you're looking at our outcomes and or you're thinking about creating additional outcomes for yourself on our workflows or other workflows that you create, don't focus so much on the name of the workflow. Focus on what you want the workflow to do next. Because it doesn't necessarily matter in the context of how Redtail captures and tracks the history of what has happened in the workflow and what is viewable to you as well as your team after the workflow has been created and completed. What the name of the workflow, the name of the outcome selected doesn't matter from a functionality standpoint so much as the next step does. So, for example, if I'm working with this workflow, this outcome could be named I don't care. Literally, we could name the name of this outcome, I don't care. But if we want the outcome, if we want the workflow to go to process distribution through online platform, if we want that to be the next step in the workflow, that's all we care about. So as you're looking at our workflows, if you don't like specifically the way in which we've named it, you're free to go ahead and modify that. However, this is one of the limitations of the workflows within Redtail. Currently, while you are certainly able to edit steps, so you can certainly edit the step name, and you can also edit the tasks within each step, you are unable to edit the outcomes. So the way in which we recommend you edit the outcomes is to go ahead, click on the outcome, make sure that you understand, let's say that you want the majority of what's in this outcome, but you just want to change a few things, hit Control or Command if you're on a Mac, copy that. Go ahead and delete this outcome. Once you do that, go ahead and click on Add Outcome. And from here, now what I can do is I can paste. I can modify whatever I want, right? I can rename the name of the outcome to whatever I want. And then again, make sure that you're focusing on what you want the next step to be. Where do you want the workflow to go if this happens? So don't focus on getting the name exactly perfect. Make sure that you're just focused on what you want the next step to be. Okay? So again, we have the step, we have task or tasks. Again, you have to have at least one step, you have to have at least one task, and you have to have at least one outcome. On the outcomes, another point that I would emphasize and make sure that you understand, outcomes can either progress, regress, or keep the workflow on the same step. Why do we do that? Well, we do that for an important reason that I'm going to talk about in a future video, and that's the ability to document what has happened. It gives you the opportunity to document time-stamped, compliant, uneditable notes. And I'm going to save that for a future workflow, for a future video, because that requires an explanation and discussion in and of itself. But what I want to do in this part is highlight the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of how workflows work. And again, keep in mind, so if you'll notice on these outcomes, I can go ahead and I can see that. So we're on first step right here, provide details of distribution. So what are the outcomes that can happen from, and we're looking at distribution from a brokerage account. Typically, that's something that is pretty popular with firms wanting to track when client requests are received to have money sent out of their account. So we can see that the outcomes here are all details received, IGO, in good order. If you see that abbreviation, that's what that stands for. Cash is available in the account. If these things are met, if we have all details received, such as distribution amount, any applicable tax withholdings, bank account information is on file, great. What we can do, and there's cash available in the account, we can skip any type of trades. You'll notice at the bottom here that the advisor would be responsible for evaluating a portfolio and freeing up cash. If cash is available in the account, we can skip steps 1, 2, and steps 2 and 3, and we can go right down to processing the distribution. However, and this is what happens when you look at workflows that involve a client input throughout the process. If we're still needing additional information, such as, and this comes up a lot towards the end of the year when you have clients in RMD status and you're wanting to make QCD, right? Qualified charitable distributions. And the client calls you up and wants money sent out of the account, but you're needing to get the name, address of the charity because the check needs to be sent directly there and there's going to be forms required. You still want to document that this process is being kicked off and that the client request came in, but you still don't have all the applicable information. And so the reason that we have this outcome, even though we're still, you'll notice at the next step, it's really not the next step. We're keeping it on this same step. And the reason that we do that, again, I'm going to insert a tease here, is so that we have the opportunity to document the details and the history of what transpired in this step. So I hope that makes some sense. The next video that we're going to dive into is talking about how to fill in the most important, the first important piece from a homework standpoint, and that's going to be starting to customize these workflow templates for your firm. So stick around for the next video, and we'll talk to you very soon.